Hello, my name is Mark Alpert, and this is my author video that I'm making for the Tome Society, which has asked me to answer a few questions about my novels. Um, I am a writer of science thrillers, and a few years ago I started writing science thrillers for young adults because I have teenagers at home, and I came up with an idea for a thriller about teenagers who turned into robots. And that became this book, The Six, my first young adult book. Very proud of it. And that came out in 2015, and it's a trilogy. And the second book in the series is called The Siege. Whoops. There you go, The Siege, which continues the story about my group of teenagers, six teenagers called the Pioneers, who they're all terminally ill teenagers. Their bodies are dying, but the U.S. Army comes up with a plan to download the contents of their minds into combat-ready U.S. Army robots, and they fight an evil artificial intelligence. And the third book in the series, The Silence, the third book in the trilogy, will come out next summer in July of 2017. Anyway, so that's who I am, Mark Alpert, and I have a list of questions that the Tome Society provided for me, and so I will now answer them. The first question is, how and when did you start writing? Okay, well that's a great question to ask of any writer. I think I I love books ever since I was a little kid, but in terms of writing, um, creative writing, I started doing it mostly in high school. I started writing poems. Just I loved writing poetry, and I continued writing poetry in college. And in fact, I loved it so much that I got a Master of Fine Arts and a degree in writing poetry, which was really fun. I loved doing that, but then I needed to get a job. And so I became what a lot of writers do when they need to make money from writing is they become journalists. And so I became a reporter for newspapers. I worked for a newspaper in New Hampshire and then for one in Alabama. And then I worked for Fortune magazine. And then I became an editor at Scientific American. And because I love science, I've always loved science in addition to loving writing. And I was an editor there for a long time. And while I was working as a journalist, though, I read a lot of fiction, um, and I started writing fiction. And as most novelists will tell you, you write a lot of books that don't get published as practice before you can actually get your first book published. So I wrote four books, four novels that didn't get published, that never saw the light of day, but they were good practice. And then my first book was published in 2008, and this was a book for adults, but it's called Final Theory. It's a book about Albert Einstein, and the premise behind this book is that Einstein, he created the theory of relativity, but in this book he comes up with a theory that's even more a theory of everything that explains both the atomic world and also the world of galaxies, and but he has to keep it secret because it's going to lead to weapons even worse than atom bombs. And so what happens is that Einstein keeps this theory secret, and then it starts to come out in the present day, and all these physicists, wind up dead. And so there's a mystery. Anyway, that was my first book for adults, and I continue to write science thrillers for adults as well as young adults. And this is my latest thriller for adults called The Orion Plan, which is about an alien invasion of New York City. But there really isn't that much difference between those books and the Six series. I try in my books with young adults. I think teenagers are pretty smart and they can understand science sometimes better than adults can. So the science in the Six is not dumbed down to any extent. It's just as interesting and sophisticated. It's just that I have teenage protagonists in my young adults books, and so that's the main difference. Okay, I think I'm up to the second question now, which is, how old were you when your first book was published? My first book was published, again, it was Final Theory, and that was published in 2008. So I was 47, which is, relatively old, I guess. But, I think it's true for lots of novelists that you need to practice at it. You need to write a lot read a lot, and learn how to write a novel. It's not easy, just writing 100,000 words in one stretch is a challenge. But even more of a challenge is making it interesting and not confusing. Those are the most important things that any fiction writer has to deal with. Make sure that it's not boring and not confusing. And so it takes some time to learn that. So it took me until I was about 47. Uh, how many books have you written and how many have been published? Oh, good question. Okay. So published books, I've written 5 thrillers for adults and 2 for young adults. That's 7 published. But then I've already written the 3rd book in the young adult trilogy. So I'm going to count that. So then that one will be published. So 8 published books, and then I had 4. I wrote 4 entire novels, 4 complete novels that were not published. So a total of 12 books, 8 of which were published. And I'm contracted to write another adult book that's due very soon, and that's going to be published by St. Martin's, and that's coming out. I'm still writing that one, so we're not going to talk about that one because while I'm writing a book, I'm kind of superstitious. I don't like to talk about it too much. Okay, next question. What are your writing rituals? Oh, that's a good question. I guess I don't have a whole lot of rituals when I sit down to write, because when you're trying to write books at a commercial rate, 1 or 2 a year, you have to write them pretty fast. I wrote the last book in about 5 or 6 months, and so I basically try to write. When I'm in the throes of writing something, I'm writing all the time, and I'll even write sometimes if I'm in the middle of a chapter. I'll write on the subway. I'll get it in a few words. I'll just dash down a few things on pen and paper, and then I'll race back to my computer and I'll put that down there. Rituals, sometimes it's smart. It's very smart sometimes not to stop writing for the day at the end of a chapter, because then the next day you're like, oh wow, how am I going to start the next chapter? It's always a good idea sometimes to before you end your writing for the day, to begin a new chapter. So then you are set for tomorrow. Then you can immediately hit the ground running. So that's a good ritual. I have a saying about writing, which is the hardest sentence to write is the next one. It's just, you just got to keep it going. It doesn't matter so much if you think the writing is terrible. It really doesn't, because the point in a first draft, at least, is to get it out there, to get it all done, and then you can always revise it. And writing is mostly revising. I do a lot of my revising, in progress. So at the end of the day, or during the course of the day, I'll look over what I've written and I'll make a million changes, or sometimes I'll just cut the whole thing and say, you know what, this isn't working, and I'll go in a different direction. But revisions, and then when the whole thing is done, I try to leave it, set it aside for a couple of weeks. Usually I show it to my editor. The editor comes back with suggestions, and then I see what works and what doesn't if I get a little distance from the book after a few weeks. And so then I can make some additional revisions. Next question. How did you research for The Six? The Six was, the book about teenagers who turn into robots. Well, that's a good question, because I did spend a fair amount of time researching this. It started with me reading about this concept called the singularity. There's this book that came out about 10 years ago called The Singularity is Near, which is talking about the idea that artificial intelligence is getting better and better. It's already, we're going to have self-driving cars. We already have Siri and Alexa, and we already have programs that can defeat the best humans in chess. And now, even at the Asian game of Go, which many people predicted, they said, no computer program will ever be able to beat human masters at that. And yet, the AlphaGo program just did that. So extrapolating from these trends, say a lot of futurists and scientists believe that eventually you're going to come up with an artificial intelligence that can do lots of different things, that can navigate, problem solve, recognize, speak, calculate, and do all these things, and will eventually sort of near what we might consider a human intelligence. Become self-aware, become able to create its own goals. Because right now programs have, we write the goals for them, and the programs try to execute them. But eventually, the idea here is that eventually you're going to create a machine that can really think for itself, set its own goals. And at that point, if it's also self-improving, if it constantly improves its performance, then you've got, a very serious artificial intelligence. And then you start to have to worry, well, are the goals of this artificial intelligence, do they conflict with humanity's goals? Because if they do, that could be a problem, because this artificial intelligence could become very powerful if it's self-improving, if it's constantly getting better at what it does. So anyway, so I read this book and I thought, wow, that's fascinating. So I started doing a lot of research about that, and then I took a tour of the IBM Research Lab in Yorktown Heights, New York. There is one of IBM's premier research labs is located out there, and I'd always wanted to visit the place just because I'm a contributing editor at Scientific American, so I wanted to write stories about that laboratory and what they're doing there. They're working on quantum computing and new kinds of materials for computing, and I thought that stuff is fascinating. So anyway, I went out there, and I also got some ideas for what the book that became The Six. In fact, the very first scene in The Six is takes place in a laboratory that's very similar to the IBM research lab. So that research was really helpful. Physics. I learned a lot about how what we know about the human brain. How our memories, how are our thoughts coded in the brain? What's going on in the signaling between the brain cells that produces a memory, a thought, an emotion? And will we ever be able to figure out, maybe through scanning the brain in greater and greater detail, how these thoughts are coded? And if we can do that, will we ever develop the ability to record all of these thoughts? You have about 100 billion neurons in your brain and trillions of connections between the different brain cells. But if you could image the brain in enough detail, you might be able to record all of the electrical activity going on inside your brain, and therefore record everything, all your memories, all your thoughts, emotions, virtues, flaws, everything. And if you can record all that, what's to stop you from digitizing it and copying it and then downloading it into a robot? It doesn't sound, I mean, it sounds completely like science fiction, and yet we're building the tools to do this right now. So I learned as much as I could about that, because that became the basic premise behind The Six, where you have teenagers, their bodies are dying, they can't be saved, and yet the minds can be recorded and put into machines. And what would that be like for those teenagers? How would life be different for them if they no longer have their bodies? I mean, it's going to have some big pluses, because you're going to have fantastic speed and strength and a robotic body, and amazing mental abilities, because you'll suddenly be able to calculate at the speed of computers. But what does this do to your humanity when you no longer have a human body? What does this do to relationships between these teens? How do they adapt? So I thought that would be a fascinating subject to explore, and that's what I did in The Six, in The Siege, and then the upcoming book, The Silence. Okay, next question. Is AI real? AI being artificial intelligence. It is. I mean, it exists right now. You have it in your iPhone. Siri is a form of it. You see it in self-driving cars. You the state of artificial intelligence right now is that certain tasks programs can do extremely well. They can beat humans at chess. They can beat humans at Jeopardy. I don't know if back 5 years ago, Jeopardy had a contest where they took the IBM program called Watson, which was a program that basically they downloaded, oh, millions and millions of documents into this program, and it found connections. It was programmed to see connections about the facts that were in these documents, and use this ability to answer questions, Jeopardy questions, which were sometimes very tricky and sometimes had an element of humor in them. If you've ever watched Jeopardy, you'll see that it's something that people thought only a human could figure out this question, because it's there's a joke involved in it, and yet the program was developed so that it could successfully answer Jeopardy questions, drawing on its enormous wealth of encyclopedia, all these thousands and millions of documents that were downloaded into the program. It was able to quickly retrieve information from all those documents and answer a Jeopardy question. And in fact, the program beat the top Jeopardy contestants. And so you see that AI is right now is at the point where it can do certain very well-defined tasks very, very well. Now, it's not a broad intelligence like human intelligence is. I mean, right? Human intelligence can do lots of things, sometimes well, sometimes not so well. I can ride a bicycle. I can walk across the room. I can write longhand, or I can type on a keyboard. I can recognize the faces of hundreds of friends and acquaintances. I can recall all these really cool songs from the 1970s and 1980s when I grew up. My brain can do a lot of these things. What defines the human brain is its the breadth and its adaptability that I could take my intelligence and apply it to many different things. AI is not at that stage just yet. But the idea is that a lot of people, researchers, scientists believe that as AI begins to master this task and then that task, first chess, then Jeopardy, then self-driving cars, then Siri, that as it develops all these different tasks, eventually you'll come up with a broad intelligence similar to human intelligence. That's still down the road, but people see it coming. So that's where the state of artificial intelligence is right now. Are any of the characters in the Six inspired by real people? Uh, yeah, I mean, all novelists, they take bits and pieces of their own lives and their friends and families or public figures, and they incorporate it. But usually you come up with something new because you fall in love with your characters because they're new. They're like your children in a way. I mean, not you don't love them as much as your real children, but you do feel an affection for them. So the main character of the Six is Adam Armstrong, and the book's told from his point of view. He's a 17-year-old and he's dying of muscular dystrophy, which is a degenerative genetic disease where there's a mutation that prevents the production of a certain protein in the muscles, dystrophin protein. And so as a child grows up, a child who suffers from muscular dystrophy, the muscles begin to deteriorate because they're not this muscle cells are not producing this essential protein. And it used to be in decades past that kids with muscular dystrophy would die very young. Nowadays, they've really improved treatment options with mechanical ventilation, because what happens in muscular dystrophy is first it affects the extremities, especially the legs, and usually kids with muscular dystrophy can't walk. They by the age of 12. They're forced to use a wheelchair by the age of 12. And then eventually, over many more years, things like the lung muscles and eventually the heart muscle is infected, and it leads to early death. Although, because of medical treatment improvements, a lot of people with muscular dystrophy now live into their 30s, which is great. But it's still an incurable disease, and for certain kids, the disease progresses much faster to the lungs and the heart, and that's the case with Adam Armstrong. He's 17, and his heart is failing, and he has less than 6 months to live. And Adam Armstrong's dad is a genius computer scientist, and he is convinced that he can save his son's life by recording everything in his mind in such detail that he encapsulates all of Adam's personality, and then taking this information and downloading it into a machine. And Adam and his father are two of the main characters in the book, and there's sort of similarities between relationship between me and my kids. Like Adam's dad is very very. Oh, excuse me one second. Speaking of being a father, I'm going to let my daughter into the house. Hold on one second, Paula. Hold that thought. Hold that thought. Hey, hi. This is my daughter Sarah. This is a video I'm doing for the Tome Society.
How are you so happy?
Oh, because I'm very happy to talk about my books. I love talking about my books. Okay. Anyway, where was I? So yeah, there are similarities that between myself, people I know, and these characters. But essentially, you use those similarities just as a jumping off point when you're creating characters, and that's what I did with the Six. Okay, what's next? Who is your favorite character from your books? Well, in this young adult trilogy, I have to say Adam. I like him the most because even though he is dying at the beginning of the book, he's not filled with bitterness or self pity. And he's not happy about it, and he's really really jealous of other kids who will live normal lives. But at the same time, he maintains a sense of humor about it in some cases, and he's not happy about it, but he's not completely destroyed by it either, and he's willing to take this leap of faith that what his father's project of converting his mind and recording it all and putting it into a machine, he's willing to take this leap of faith that it will actually be him that survives this. Because there's a question, what is your identity? Is your identity associated with your body, or is there something separate from your body called the mind or the soul, something that could be taken out? And so he struggles with this question before he actually undergoes this procedure to become a robot. He struggles with this question: well, will it be me in the robot, or will it be just a copy? Will it be just a clone of me in some way, a mental clone of my mind? And so he struggles with this, but he becomes convinced, no, it will be me, because he comes to this conclusion, and so he has a certain amount of bravery, and I really admire that in him, and I like his just his voice. Okay, what books are you working on right now? Well, there is, like I said, I just finished the manuscript of The Silence, which is the third book in the Six trilogy. There's The Six, The Siege, and The Silence. And that book is we're still editing it, but it will be coming out in July of 2017. And at the same time, I'm writing another book. This one is for adults. We haven't figured out a title yet, but it will be about genetic editing that is done in a secret government program, and it's done on the prisoners in death row. So I thought, wow, that'd be kind of a cool idea, that sounded interesting to me. So that's my next project I'm working on. And what do you do in your free time? Well, let's see. I go biking a lot. Um, I, I hang out with my kids. I love hanging out with my kids. Um, and what else do we do, Sarah?
You binge watched
What?
that Netflix.
Oh yeah, I binge watched some Netflix shows. Yeah, I watched that one. What was it? Stranger Things. That was really cool. It was like a real throwback. Yeah, I watched the whole thing in like a couple of days. I really liked it. Okay, and I just do a lot of reading for pleasure. I love reading Stephen King and all these books. I love Lee Child, and I love a lot of other young adult authors. I really like Rick Yancey, and authors like that. So that's what I do. Um, what was your favorite subject in school? Huh. Well, I was really a math science geek. So I at the time I just loved math and science. But then when I got to college, I got more interested in English classes and poetry. Um, and I loved writing poetry. I loved I love stuff like that. I took a variety of classes. I love the fact that you can take classes in religion and philosophy and art and music. And so um, it's hard to point to a favorite. I think actually I took this history class once called History of the Early Middle Ages, and I really loved that class because the professor said, you know what, we don't really have a lot of sources for the early Middle Ages. It's not, there aren't that many primary documents. We really don't know a lot about 500 years of human history between like 500 AD and 1000 AD. Don't know a lot, and that's fascinating. So I thought, wow, that course made a big impression on me. Are you a plotter or a pantser? Okay, this is sort of a technical question that a lot of writers face because writers sometimes divide themselves into the plotters, the people who, before they even start writing a novel, write this very long, involved outline, and they plot out exactly what happens in every chapter and what character does what at every which time. And then there's the people who are called the pantsers, who do everything by the seat of their pants. They have just a vague idea of the book when they start the book, and they just go where the novel takes them. Now, for me, I am sort of a combination of the two. I mean, I do write an outline before every book because I find I really need a structure. I really need to know, I'm going to start at point A. What is point A? Who are the characters? And then I'm going to end up, after 100,000 words at, point B, which is, all the way in the distance and an ending. So I need that. And I know that there are certain points between A and B that I want to hit. I want to do this because, oh, wouldn't that be cool? Like I thought, wow, in the six, wouldn't it be cool to have robots fighting tanks or robots fighting helicopters? I gotta get that in there. Or how about a robot who transfers his mind to a nuclear missile? Wouldn't that be cool? So I knew there were all these points I wanted to hit, but I wasn't exactly sure. So I had the route sort of mapped out a little bit, but not in detail. So when I started each chapter, it was kind of a surprise to me what was going to happen. I put in enough leeway in my plot. It wasn't so rigorously plotted that I knew exactly what was going to happen at every point in the book. I just knew the general points I wanted to hit, and I was able. That gave me some freedom to try to do things that were unexpected in the book. So there's a mix there of plotting and pantsing. um, where is the most interesting place you've ever visited? Okay, I know this for sure. While I was doing research for my second book, my second novel for adults, which was called The Omega Theory, I visited the country of Turkmenistan, which is in Central Asia. It used to be part of the Soviet Union, but then, when the Soviet Union broke up in 1991, it became an independent country. But it's still very Stalinist. It's basically the Communist Party boss of this country became the dictator, and it's not a great place to live in terms of freedom because there isn't any. Um, but I really wanted to visit this country because I was fascinated by it. It's just north of Iran, so I knew the plot of my book was going to involve some kind of fighting in Iran and starting in Turkmenistan. And so I knew I wanted to go there. But I also read about the country has a large part of it is desert, and the desert sits atop this huge bubble of natural gas. This country has become fairly rich because there's natural gas. They would sell it to either the Russians or the Chinese. Anyway, the Soviets tried to drill for this natural gas way back in the 1970s, but the Soviet engineers didn't really understand the geology so well. So they went into the desert, they put in these drilling rigs, they sank the drilling rig into the sand, and they didn't understand the geology, and the entire drilling rig fell, down this shaft into this bubble of natural gas. It was a total disaster. It created this huge hole in the desert, which is as big as a football field, and and because it's connected to the bubble of natural gas below, the natural gas started billowing out of the hole. And I don't know what happened. Someone threw a match or something, but the whole thing went up in flames. And so for the for the past 40 years, there's been this gas crater that's there's been flames rising out of this thing, and it'll never run out of fuel because there's so much natural gas below the desert of Turkmenistan, and there's no way they could fill it in because the country, it's in this totally remote area, and you'd have to truck I don't know how many billions of tons of dirt to plug this hole. So it's become a tourist kind of attraction, but very obscure. It's hard to get into Turkmenistan. They like I said, it's a terrible dictatorship. So you have to file all these visas, and you can't tell. I was a journalist at the time. They said no, don't say you're a journalist. You'll never get into this country if you say you're a journalist. So they called me a consultant. That was the way to get in. So anyway, and then I got there, so what happens is there's this huge. You go out to the desert in these 4-wheel drive vehicles, and you go at night because it's more impressive. The fiery crater. It's called the gas crater of Darvaza, the burning gas crater of Darvaza. And you go there at night, and you're going for miles and miles. You don't see anything. It's totally dark, and then you see this glow on the horizon, and then you get closer, and it's like the mouth of hell. It's just this amazing gas crater. Flames coming out of it, and we got out of the vehicle, and I started going toward the edge of the crater, and they told me, no, don't go too close to the edge because the sand is not so stable. You could slide right in. And I thought, oh, this is amazing. This book is writing itself. You can just imagine all these bad guys throwing their prisoners into the burning gas crater of Darvaza. So definitely that was the coolest place I've ever been. Okay, and the last question: what is your advice for young writers? Well, it's simple, folks. If you want to write, you got to read. You got to read a lot, and read for enjoyment because hopefully, if you like writing, you'll also like reading. So read widely, read every kind of book, read fiction and nonfiction. And if you want to write in a certain genre, if you want to write science fiction, read a lot of science fiction. If you want to write fantasy, read a lot of fantasy books. So it's basically you only do this if you love it, And so if you love books, I think you'll find, as I did, that when you read a really great book, you think, wow, I wish I could write a book like that. Whoa, maybe I can write a book like that. And so that's my advice for you. Just never stop reading, and when you start writing. Just keep going. Don't be worried so much. Oh, this isn't good. This isn't. This doesn't look professional. Don't give yourself a break. Just let yourself write, and sooner or later you'll discover that you're getting good at it. Anyway, I think I answered all the questions. Thank you, Tome Society, for inviting me to give this video, and And good luck, all you young readers and writers.